Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today I'm finally going to be talking about the debut album from Kelela called Take Me Apart. So I'll be honest, I should have covered this record weeks ago. I can admit that. And well, if we were to go back to, say, 2014, I would say my prior ambivalence or disinterest with this record is due to my general unfamiliarity and distaste for certain tropes in R&B. That's changed a lot over the past 3 years. I can't use it as an excuse, because really that was all it was. Thanks to me covering a fair amount more in R&B and finding styles, sounds, and really a couple albums that I really like. But let me be more honest here. The reason I was not more on the ball with covering this album was a lot more human and mildly more embarrassing. Because somewhere in my brain, wires got crossed. I've covered a ton of albums this year, and I kept thinking that Kelela was Kehlani, another R&B act who released her full-length debut album this year, and with whom I was a fair bit more familiar thanks to a number of guest appearances, and also an album that I completely missed covering. Now, I did listen to Sweet Sexy Savage. It's okay, a few good songs let down by more filler than it needed and some frustrating production choices, but again, I'm getting off track here because Kelela is a very different performer, even if their career trajectories fit a pretty similar timeline. Now, from the guest appearances that I did go back to hear from Kelela, she was going in a far less commercial direction, signed to Warp and working with Gorillaz and Solange and Danny Brown. And her own musical background is a lot more eclectic. She started off singing in jazz and even a progressive metal group before switching to more alternative, electronic-leaning R&B. In other words, when you factor in the critical acclaim that this record has piled up and the lineup of producers and songwriters that she was working with, the names that really jumped out at me were Ariel Rechtshain, Romy Croft of the XX, and Arca, this was bound to be a pretty fascinating and even experimental listen. So, okay, what'd I find on Take Me Apart? Well, folks, I've given this a lot of listens over the past week or so, and if I can be blunt, I wish I liked this a lot more than I do. I mean, I certainly see the appeal. I can see why in R&B this will certainly be considered genre-pushing in its inclusion of experimental electronics that you don't often hear of this style and tone, but with every single listen, it just didn't grab me as much as I wanted it to, especially as I get the feeling that Arca and his imitators can feel increasingly one-dimensional the more records they put out. But even beyond that, when I look at what just Kelela is bringing to the table here, okay, look, the album might have its moments, but as a whole, I'm pretty underwhelmed by this. It's decent, but I'm not sure I would call it great. And I think this is where we have to start off with Kelela herself, and I'm honestly struggling to pin down why I'm not as enamored with her voice as I'd like to be, because she is definitely on a technical level a good singer with a lot of precision and control of her delivery that can carefully modulate her understated poise while showing off a pretty damn impressive range on songs like LMK, even hitting a few whistle tones, which, yeah, it sounded pretty damn good. The most obvious comparison point for her vocal tone is Janet Jackson, perhaps a little bit less husky and more comfortable with belting, anchored by a rough cushion of multi-tracking to fill up the vocal melody when she needs it, but it's not always there, it's not always essential, especially with traces that remind me more expressively of Bjork, but I'd be lying if I found her as naturally as expressive as Janet has been in the past. Part of it is a feeling that she's not quite as loose, a little bit more meticulous and calculated, not quite as focused on riding the groove in the same way in that more organic fashion, which, you know what, makes a certain amount of sense when you consider the production here. And I'm almost at a little bit lost of where to even start, because from the multi-tracking onward, I'm not at all convinced that this production flatters Kelela's voice or her delivery. She tends to speak with soft-spoken cooing, not really attempting to command the more unstable warping mixes like, say, FKA Twigs could do on LP1. But that's a problem when not only is she stuck dealing with multi-tracking that only seems to emphasize rough contrasting edges between the vocal tracks, but also the massive crushing beats, the let-in grooves, and atonal synth shifts that have been the trademark of a lot of her producers, especially Arca. She's stuck competing with those tones. And that's before you even consider the layers of auto-tune or pitch shifting that get tacked onto Blue Light or On and On or the title track. Even with the multi-tracking, Kelela can feel enveloped or swallowed in this mix, where her emotive subtleties are lost in a mix set to roil over whatever's in its path like a gelatinous cube. Now, look, on the one hand, if you're not familiar with the style of production, I can see how its fusion with mainstream or even alternative R&B would be challenging or distinctly different. And you would likely be right in that regard. But if I think back to Janet Jackson's more experimental projects, her producers were at least conscious enough of how to coax the mix and grooves to fit with her voice, instead of treating it more as just an incidental element set to clash against keening synth contortions, or facing a mix that was just gonna crush it underfoot. And sure, you could argue that it kind of fits some of the content of the conflicted, messy relationships where there is no easy easy flow or consistent groove to things. But you know what? That doesn't make the hook stronger or give the record more flow, especially when you're already plenty familiar with Arca's production style and you're not really as wowed by a formula that he's shown many times before and frankly done a little better. Now, that's not saying that we don't get some beautiful melodic moments, but again, they are incidental moments that rarely contribute to a stronger, more cohesive whole, like the slightly more stable, windswept synth groove on the hook of Waitin, or the muted restraint of Better, or the pretty elegant swells of strength anchoring Anon that become all the more pronounced on Turn to Dust. But then, of course, we have to get to the content and a lot of the writing, and you know what, maybe this was an issue of my expectations, because when you have production that can feel as off-kilter as this does, as experimental as this is, you would think the writing would feel more challenging in that territory. And, okay, look, it's not bad, but I can't be the only one who finds it a fair bit less interesting than you would expect. Much of it plays pretty close to very conventional R&B subject matter. Sensual love jams, emotionally complicated breakup songs, you get the picture, you've heard a lot of this before. And more to the point, the detail on these songs can feel a little underweight or generally not all that impressive. I do appreciate the framing that seems to be a little bit more emotionally balanced and complex. The most obvious case is On, that shows the relationship breaking down from both sides and then repeating the arguments again and again. But Frontline certainly shows the nuance and how the guy was pulling this girl into a self-consuming miasma, necessitating the breakup from her, which is also more pronounced on the acknowledgement that ultimately it was healthier for the both of them to split on Better. I like that sort of detail. And yet when you follow the messy emotions of seeing him with somebody else on Waitin, there is some impact, especially when you can tell on songs like this and Enough that Kelela knows rationally she shouldn't care that this guy will just repeat the same cycles with her, but she does care deep down. There is some emotional logic to it, even if it flies against any sort of more actual grounded logic. And yet that clinical nature in a lot of her writing becomes more pronounced on songs like LMK, where she does care and the situation really is not that complicated. She just wants reciprocal communication, and that hookup, it will actually happen. And honestly, these are good moments with real emotional nuance, but none of it I would call that revelatory. And when you pair it with sex jams that don't really have the same sort of groove or tonal choice to feel all that sexy, and lyrics that don't really do all that much for me, it just doesn't click. I'm sorry. So look, this is the sort of record where I completely, totally understand the critical acclaim, because it's heading towards relatively unexplored territory, confusing the off-kilter instability of production from guys like Arca with modern R&B. That's new for the genre, and a singer who can clearly deliver in terms of writing and delivery, and critics love this sort of thing on a conceptual level. Hell, most of the time I would include myself in that camp. The problem here for me is the execution, where the marriage of these sorts of vocals and writing with this style of misshapen, unstable production doesn't flatter the vocals nor the writing on an aesthetic level, lacking the sort of subtlety to support them rather than just engulf them, which can kind of undercut the emotional dynamics for me. And on top of not really being won over by the writing or the delivery, yeah, okay, I see the appeal. Again, I'll say it again, I like some of the presentation. There are good moments here, but I don't think this is really for me. I'm thinking a solid 6 out of 10. Definitely recommended if you're curious about the sound. For most mainstream R&B listeners, this will be different, but it doesn't quite connect. Hey, if you're this close to the cutting edge, you won't win over everybody, and I can accept that. So if you're curious about this sort of thing, worth a look. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Folks, I know I wanted to like this more too, but again, Arca's starting to wear a little bit stale on me, and I didn't think the writing and delivery quite won me over in the same way. It happens. But if you want to buy the record, links in the description below, and I got the poll up there for all you to tell me how wrong I am. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process and support this channel, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add records or even movies or even a top 10 list to that schedule. I really hope you guys can get on this so I don't end up covering Kelela a month late, but hey, there's your option. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.